On a summer morning in London, people woke up choking on a smell that wasn't just foul, it felt alive. Curtains were soaked in vinegar, windows were nailed shut. Families ate with one hand covering their mouths, praying the air would pass them by. Inside Parliament, the men who ruled an empire wrapped the river-facing halls in cloth, and still fled the chamber. The stench crawled from doorstep to street, from street to the Thames, from the Thames into the heart of power. How does a civilization collapse because of something you can't see when only the first day began? In 1858, London was the nerve center of an empire that insisted it was modern. Steam whistles cut through the mornings. Coal smoke hung over the rooftops like a low, permanent ceiling. Along the docks, ships from every corner of the world nosed into the Thames, their hulls heavy with tea, sugar, timber, cotton proof that Britain's wealth could be measured in tonnage. The city was swelling faster than it could breathe. Every year, more people poured in, chasing factory wages and the promise of streets lit by gas, of shop windows glittering after dark, of progress you could see. New rail lines stitched neighborhoods together. Bridges multiplied. Clerks hurried past market stalls. Horses clattered over stone. And from a distance, it looked like civilization winning. But beneath this image of power was a quieter reality, one that never made it into the paintings. London had always been dense, but now it was packed. Entire families lived in single rooms. Courtyards became makeshift towns. Alleys narrowed under the pressure of bodies and brick. In the wealthier districts, there were broad avenues and clean facades. In the poorer ones, there were open drains, overflowing cesspits, and water that carried a faint, constant warning. And the irony was, this Londoners did care about cleanliness. The Victorian age adored order. It measured respectability in polished boots and stiff collars. Houses were scrubbed, streets were swept. Perfume, lavender, carbolic, anything that promised freshness sold well. People believed filth could be conquered if it was removed from sight. So the city learned to hide.
Thank you, sir.
To understand what came next, we must first understand what London thought sanitation meant. For centuries, waste had been dealt with locally cesspools in basements, privies in backyards, night soil men hauling barrels through the dark. It was unpleasant, but it was contained, at least in theory. Then came two forces that changed everything: numbers and water. As London grew, the old system buckled. Cesspits filled faster than they could be emptied. The smell was unbearable. The complaints were constant. And in response, people did something that felt like an upgrade. They connected their homes to drains. They flushed. They sent the problem away. The trouble was, away meant downhill. New sewers were built, but not with the purpose you might imagine. They weren't designed to carry waste out of the city and treat it. They were designed to move it out of your street, out of your house, out of your life. And because the Thames cut through London like an artery, the simplest destination was the river itself. It was efficient. It was invisible. It was, to many, progress. More importantly, it was comforting. Because if the street looked cleaner, then surely the city was healthier. If the stench was fainter, then surely the danger was smaller. London began to believe it had escaped. The old world escaped the medieval city of plague pits and open gutters. But it hadn't escaped. It had reorganized. The waste still existed. It was simply being gathered, concentrated, and delivered to one place day after day into the same waterway that carried barges. Washed clothes, cooled factories, and supplied drinking water to thousands. The city was not becoming cleaner. It was becoming better at pretending. And in the middle of it all, the Thames kept flowing tidal. At low tide, it exposed its banks like a wound. At high tide, it pushed the contents back through the city. As if refusing to let go, London treated it as a backdrop, a highway, a symbol. Few wanted to admit it was also a mirror. In the heat of a summer, that mirror would speak. The origin of the smell was not a mystery. It was an engineering decision, repeated 1,000,000 times, in every home, every street, every workshop. London had built a habit of sending anything unpleasant into water. Slops from kitchens, waste from stables, the runoff from slaughterhouses and tanneries. And now, increasingly, what came from the human body itself flushed away with a pull of a handle, as if nature could be erased by plumbing. The Thames became the city's great disappearing trick, not because it truly carried the filth away, but because London wanted to believe it did. Pipes emptied into drains, drains fed sewers, sewers poured into the river, and the river, winding through the capital, was asked to be both highway and grave. To understand why this mattered so much, we must understand how people thought danger traveled. Most Londoners didn't fear contamination as we would define it today. They feared air, bad air, miasma, a sickly, invisible fog that rose from rot and settled into lungs. If a place stank, it wasn't just disgusting, it was threatening. Every improvement in comfort became another contribution. Each new toilet felt like civilization ceramic, clean, effortless. Yet every flush was a vote to push the burden downstream, out of mind, into someone else's breath. When thousands did it daily, the river didn't merely receive waste, it stored it, warmed it, and waited until the weather turned and the city paid. So the city fought the wrong enemy with complete confidence. They didn't see a river turning into a sewer. They saw a river that smelled and assumed the smell itself was the weapon. They hung heavy curtains, soaked in chemicals and vinegar. They burned tar and incense. They carried handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. They tried to scrub the world with scent, like perfume could overwrite reality. But then came the heat. In the summer of 1858, the sun baked London. The water level dropped. The current slowed. The tide pushed in and pulled back like a lung that refused to stop breathing, except now it was breathing filth. At low tide, the Thames exposed its banks, and the mud left behind was not ordinary mud. It was a dark, greasy layer of everything the city had been hiding. And it didn't stay on the banks. Bubbles broke the surface. A sheen spread across the water. The smell climbed out in waves, first near the drains, then along the embankments, then into the streets that faced the river. It seeped into doorways. It clung to clothes. It invaded rooms even when windows were sealed. It turned meals into endurance tests. This was not one source. It was a whole metropolis emptied into a single channel. Tens of thousands of cesspools had been bypassed. Tons of waste had been redirected. What used to be scattered, absorbed, and buried was now concentrated, mixed and stirred day after day by the tide. And Londoners lived beside it. Water companies drew from the Thames. Boats crowded its surface. Children played near its edges. Laundry was rinsed in it. Barges pushed through it. Their ropes wet, their decks slick. The river touched everyone, whether they wanted to admit it or not. More importantly, the stink did something the statistics never could. It made the problem undeniable. A hidden system had become a public experience. The city's private shame had become a shared atmosphere. London thought it had upgraded from filth to cleanliness, from medieval chaos to industrial order, but all it had done was move the rot from the alley to the artery, then stand back, horrified, when the artery began to speak. By late June, the Thames stopped behaving like a river and started behaving like a sentence, one that could no longer be interrupted. The heat settled over London, and refused to move. The sun beat down on exposed mudbanks. The water turned sluggish. Everything the city had poured into its great artery was now being cooked in place, and when the wind shifted, it carried the result straight into the street. Shopkeepers tied cloth over their faces. Families shut windows and wedged towels into the cracks. Carriages rolled by with passengers holding scented handkerchiefs to their mouths, eyes watering, trying not to breathe too deeply. Even the animals reacted. Horses snorted and balked near the river, as if instinct could recognize what pride would not. Then the panic climbed higher. Newspapers printed what everyone already knew, because now it was impossible to pretend. The smell had become a civic emergency. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was oppressive. It settled into rooms. It invaded churches, markets, hospitals, courts, and in a city that believed bad air was dangerous. The great stink felt like an invisible siege. But the most telling scene wasn't in a slum, it was in Westminster. The Houses of Parliament sat beside the Thames like a monument. This was where budgets were approved and the machinery of an empire kept turning. Yet that summer, even that machinery began to choke. Members tried to fight it the way London always fought filth with fabric and chemicals. Curtains were soaked in chloride of lime. Drapes were hung over windows and doorways, as if the right barrier could keep reality outside. The river didn't care. The stench slipped through. It rose from the embankment, seeped into the halls, and flooded the chambers. Debates were cut short. Meetings were abandoned. Men who argued calmly about war and trade found themselves covering their faces like frightened children. The air itself had become political. And that was the tipping point. Because for years, London had been warned. Engineers and reformers had spoken about sewage. But warnings are easy to ignore when they are distant, when they belong to other people. Now the crisis had reached the one place it was never allowed to reach, the center of power. More importantly, it reached the fashionable neighborhoods downriver. It reached the terraces and drawing rooms. In a city built on distance from the poor, distance from the dirty, the stink collapsed the map. There was no safe district, no clean corner, no escape route that didn't involve breathing. So the government began to move, not because it suddenly discovered compassion, but because it had finally lost comfort. The story of 1858 is sometimes told as a strange joke, an empire humbled by a smell. But that smell was a message the system was failing. The Thames was not a sewer that happened to carry ships. It was a sewer that happened to be visible. Londoners could see it. Black water sliding past the banks. Refuse bobbing at the surface. Officials called it a nuisance, but faces turned pale. When even the river breeze was unbearable, London understood this was governance failing, not weather. The tide pulling it away, then pushing it back again, like the city's waste, returning for a second conversation. Now the question wasn't whether London was civilized. The question was whether civilization could survive its own inventions when the very tools meant to make life cleaner had turned the capital's lifeline into a weapon. If it wasn't a plague sweeping through the streets, why did a smell have the power to force an empire to act? What people didn't realize in that choking summer was that the smell was doing what decades of reports could not. It made the crisis personal. It made it immediate. It made it impossible to ignore. Parliament could seal its windows. It could hang chemical-soaked curtains. It could shorten its sessions and retreat into cleaner rooms. But the Thames was still there, rising and falling with the tide, carrying London's waste like a public accusation. And once the men in power could no longer sit in their own chambers, the question changed. Not should we fix this, but how fast can we fix this before the city breaks? Now, the twist is that this wasn't triggered by a sudden scientific breakthrough. Germ theory wasn't marching into Westminster with banners. Most officials still believed in miasma, bad air rising from rot. In a way, they were wrong about the mechanism, and perfectly right about the urgency. Because even if the smell itself wasn't a disease, it was proof of a system that had collapsed. So London did what empires rarely do. It spent a fortune on something no one could wave like a trophy. To understand the solution, we have to follow the pipes. The engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, proposed a plan with a simple, brutal idea. Stop feeding the river. Build vast intercepting sewers along the Thames. Collect the flow before it reached the waterway. Then send it east, downstream of the city, where it could be discharged far from London's lungs. It was infrastructure as containment, a wall made of brick. Then the ground opened. Streets were torn apart. Trenches swallowed men and horses. Millions of bricks formed tunnels tall enough to stand in. Arched like cathedrals turned sideways. Pumping stations rose like fortresses, built to lift the sewage when gravity failed. And slowly, the capital's great disappearing trick became an engineered system, not a wish. More importantly, the Great Stink rewired the social contract. It taught a hard lesson. Cleanliness isn't a private virtue. You can't scrub your doorstep and call it solved. When millions share the same air and water, sanitation becomes a public responsibility. The state wasn't only protecting borders anymore, it was protecting breath. Bazalgette built bigger than he needed to, because he understood what politicians often forget: cities don't stop growing. His sewers were oversized, expensive, and meant to last for the future London no one could yet see. And in many ways, they did. Even today, parts of his system still quietly serve the city. The embankments reshaped the riverfront, burying the old stench under stone, traffic, and routine quietly forever. Because if this story feels uncomfortably familiar, it's because we've lived our own versions of it. The fear of the invisible, the instinct to close windows, the sense that something in the environment is slipping past our precautions and into our homes. In 1858, London learned you can't perfume over reality. You either build the systems that keep a city healthy, or you wait until the city forces you to. History, close watching the past so we can understand the present. I'll see you in the next era.